The following story was written as part of a fully online writing class designed and taught by author Meagan J. Meehan. The stories from this class were subsequently printed in an anthology series titled Wicked Writing Volume 1, courtesy of Stitched Smile Publications. To join the next class, email Meagan J. Meehan directly at artsycr8TIVEINT@gmail.com. To purchase a copy of the book, visit its Amazon page, linked in the description below. And to learn more about Stitched Smile Publications, visit their official website at www.stitchedsmilepublications.com. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Meagan and her authors, and enjoy the story. The sun was just starting to rise above the city skyline, but Greg and his wife Emily had already been up for hours. Emily was packing to go on a trip to see her family. Greg and Emily lived and worked in the greater Washington, D.C. area. Greg's family lived relatively close by in Maryland, but Emily had moved to D.C. from Oregon and hadn't seen her relatives in over 2 years. Emily had been saving vacation time for over a year and had been looking forward to introducing Greg to her family. Unfortunately, Greg had recently started a new job and didn't have much vacation time to spare for a large trip. He and Emily had talked about it, and they decided that she should go home to see her family, and he would be able to meet them another time. Emily had been disappointed by the decision, but she could see the practicality. The only alternative would be to wait another year until Greg had enough vacation time as well, an alternative that didn't suit Emily or her family. Greg had to be at work early to attend a meeting, so Emily would be taking her car separately to the airport. When they were done loading Emily's suitcases into the trunk, Emily came back inside to give him a hug and a kiss goodbye. "I love you. See you in 2 weeks, okay?" Emily said. "I love you too. Tell your folks that I'm sorry I couldn't come, but I'll try to come next time," Greg said, giving Emily a kiss. Emily then left, while Greg went about making a cup of coffee from their Keurig coffee machine. A moment later, he thought he heard Emily say something from the driveway. "What's that?" he called. There was no answer. Greg waited a moment, but he didn't hear Emily's voice again. He guessed he just imagined it. Still, he listened just in case she had said something, only giving up when he heard her car start and pull out of their driveway. Greg left for work a few minutes later, grabbing his coffee and a bagel so that he could eat breakfast on the way to work. His work day dragged by, probably because he knew that he would be going home not to the love of his life, but to a dark and empty house. Not that Greg was entirely upset to have the house to himself for the next 2 weeks. The life of a bachelor could be a lot of fun, after all, as long as you know it is only a temporary situation. Greg was looking forward to playing video games all evening, going out fishing, and maybe inviting his buddies over for a poker night without having to worry about Emily's approval. Still, when he got home that night, he couldn't help but notice how empty the house felt. There was nobody to share a meal with, talk about his day to, or cuddle up next to in bed at night. Greg imagined he would have a certain amount of fun for the first few days that Emily was gone, but he knew that he would spend most of those 2 weeks desperately missing her and looking forward to her return. Later that evening, his phone chimed, indicating that he had gotten a text message. He'd been expecting one from Emily a few hours earlier to let him know that she had arrived safely. When he hadn't received one, he tried calling her phone, but it had gone straight to voicemail. Her phone was either turned off or dead. Greg was annoyed. Emily was known for being forgetful about things like that, but sometimes he felt that she didn't take his feelings and worries about her safety all that seriously. When he checked his phone, however, the number that had texted him was not Emily's. It was a number he had hoped to never see again. The number belonged to Rachel, Greg's psycho ex-girlfriend, who had stalked him for months after he had broken things off with her. Rachel's pattern of strange behavior had dwindled over the past year, and Greg had hoped that after marrying Emily, Rachel would have finally moved on. "Hey, would you like to meet me sometime this week?" Rachel's text had read. Greg looked incredulously at the message. He considered just ignoring it, but he knew Rachel would keep persisting until he gave her an answer. "What do you want?" he texted back at her. "I just want us to be together again," was her reply. "I told you, I'm not interested in seeing you again. You know I'm married now, don't you?" "I know." "Then why don't you just move on and find someone else?" "I want to be with you." Greg was frustrated and unnerved. He thought he had put this relationship and all the baggage that went with it behind him. But here she was, starting up the same shit all over again. Instinctively, Greg glanced out the window to see if he could see Rachel's car outside. He looked up and down the street, but didn't see her vehicle anywhere. At least she wasn't watching him right now. "Listen to me. I never, ever want to see you again. Is that crystal clear to you?" Greg texted to Rachel again. She replied, "Don't do this to me. I love you and I need you. I can't live without you in my life." "Just stop. Go away and stop trying to contact me." "You're mine. I will have you with me again." "I'm not yours. I haven't been yours for 3 years. You need to stop this." "If you won't be with me, I'm going to do something drastic." This last message caused a quiet unease for Greg. Rachel had always been strange and obsessive. She had never tried to do anything to hurt him before, but this last message seemed to be a thinly veiled threat, or perhaps an escalation in her behavior. "What is that supposed to mean?" Greg asked. "If you don't agree to be with me, I'm going to cut off a body part and mail it to you each day until you do." Greg couldn't believe his eyes. He reread the message twice to make sure he wasn't just imagining this strange scenario. What the absolute fuck? She was going to mutilate herself and mail pieces to him unless he agreed to go out with her again? "She's lost it," Greg muttered to himself. Naturally, Greg considered the possibility that she was just bluffing. How many times had she threatened to hurt herself if he hadn't come back to her before? 12, at least, but she was still alive and well from the looks of it, using the term well liberally, of course. So he decided not to play this particular game with her. He decided to text her one last time. "You're fucking nuts! I'm not doing this with you! I'm turning off my phone and going to bed. Get the hell out of my life, you psycho bitch!" Greg didn't wait for a response. He simply turned off his phone and tossed it onto the counter beside the dishwasher. No doubt she would continue to text him, but he was done listening to anything Rachel had to say. Greg turned on his phone again later that night and listened to it buzz as a slew of texts popped up. Greg let them come, but refused to check any of them. Sleep didn't come easily to Greg that night. He tried taking his mind off Rachel's threat by watching movies and playing video games, but she was still there in the back of his mind. By the next day, though, Greg had largely forgotten about his strange conversation with Rachel. He had a busy day at work and was commended by his boss for giving a very successful presentation of their latest product to their clients. Considering the good work he had been doing so far, Greg thought he would be a shoo-in for his company's yearly bonus, and perhaps even an early promotion. However, his good feelings were dashed when he checked the mail that night and discovered an unmarked, unaddressed envelope. There was no stamp, only writing on the front that said, "For Greg." Curious, he opened up the envelope and let the small item contained inside fall into his hand. Instantly, he screamed and dropped the object to the ground. "Holy Christ!" Greg exclaimed, utterly horrified. The envelope contained a bloody, human ear. By the amount of blood in the envelope, it looked like it had been sawed off the side of someone's head while they were still alive. Blood from it and the hacked-off ear had dribbled onto Greg's hand, causing it to become slick and grimy. Greg, nauseated by the sight, rushed to the side of his house, collapsed against the front stoop, and vomited into the grass. Rachel had made good on her threat. She'd hacked off her own ear and sent it to him in the mail. Although, no, she hadn't sent it. There was no address or return address, and no stamp. She had to have delivered the letter in person to his mailbox. Greg shakily got to his feet, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He breathed heavily, leaning against the side of his house. Once he decided he wasn't in any danger of passing out, he considered what his next move would be. Obviously, he would have to contact the police and tell them what had happened. The ear was still laying in the grass next to the mailbox, so he would have to use that as evidence. Probably calling 911 was a bit of a stretch. He, nor anyone else, was really in immediate danger. Mostly he was just freaking out. He decided calling the non-emergency police number would be the practical approach. Greg went inside and immediately dialed the local police department, explaining to the dispatcher what had happened. She took down his address and informed him that she would dispatch an officer to the scene. Greg asked what he should do with the ear and was advised to leave it where it was until police arrived. Greg thanked her and hung up the phone. He then shakily poured himself a whiskey on the rocks and went out onto his stoop to sip it where he could keep watch on the mailbox and wait for the officers to arrive. Later that evening, a marked cruiser pulled up in front of his home, and 2 police officers got out. Greg stood, thanked them for coming, and proceeded to tell them everything he knew about Rachel, the text message conversation the previous evening, and the severed ear by the mailbox. Both officers listened and took down the information he gave them. One of them inspected his phone, briefly scanning over all the text messages that were sent back and forth. One of the officers, Williams, according to his badge name, advised Greg that he could keep his phone in his possession if he wanted to, but also advised him not to delete the text message exchange between Rachel and himself, in case they needed to use it for evidence later on. The other officer, who Greg didn't get the name of, produced a pair of what looked like long tweezers and an evidence bag. He then placed the ear into the evidence bag and marked it with a biohazard sticker. "We'll take this into evidence and put it on ice to preserve it. You did a good job responding to this person. Once we have Rachel in custody, we'll have all the evidence we need to charge her with stalking and make sure she doesn't bother you again. In the meantime, if you don't have a court order of restraint, I'd strongly advise you to seek one out." "Thanks. Yeah, I'll definitely look into that," Greg said. Officer Williams gave a card to Greg containing his direct number. "Give me a call if anything else funny happens, or if you get any more body parts from Rachel. We'll step up patrols in your area as well." "Thank you," Greg said again. After the officers had left, Greg found that he could put his focus on little else beyond the latest and greatest sick game that Rachel was playing. Putting her hacked-off ear in his mailbox? That was quite literally Vincent van Gogh level crazy. Who knew what she might do next? One thing was for sure, though, and that was that he had no intention of checking his messages or talking to her again tonight. His only comforting thought was that, at the very least, Emily was far away, visiting her parents in Oregon. Probably the safest place she could be given the circumstances. Rachel, though, was true to her word. Over the next few days, Greg continued to receive body parts in the mail from Rachel. The next day had brought the other ear. The day after that had been a finger. The day after that, a thumb. Rather than visiting his mailbox in person again, Rachel had taken to putting the body parts in plastic storage bags, placing them in envelopes, and mailing them to him in the traditional way. The police had kept their word too, as far as Greg was concerned. Each time a new body part turned up in his mailbox, they came to collect it. The police checked the postmarks on each envelope and determined that Rachel had been dropping them off at different post office boxes within town, or in a neighboring town, each day. Because the police didn't know which drop box she would use next, there was no way for them to stake out his mailbox or any given drop box and wait for Rachel to show up. The police went to Rachel's address, or at least the last address Greg remembered her living in, but when they checked it out, they discovered that Rachel had moved out a year earlier and left no forwarding address. The police then checked government records and discovered her current address. However, they found it abandoned when they went to investigate. An APB was put out for her registered vehicle, which also turned up nothing. Greg couldn't help but feel frustrated by the situation. The police were all looking for Rachel, but despite all efforts, they couldn't find what would now be an extremely disfigured woman, who somehow found a way to keep mailing body parts to him. Greg was still refusing to look at his text messages the whole time in order to avoid seeing any messages from Rachel. Emily would probably be worried sick about him by now as well. She would undoubtedly be trying to text him at some point over the past several days, but if she had, he hadn't responded to her. Even if she had contacted him and knew of the situation he was going through, she would probably be even more worried about him. Finally, the day came when Greg, feeling a great deal of trepidation, checked his mailbox and was greeted with the sickest present yet. Greg stared in horror at what Rachel had done. There was no envelope this time, so Greg knew Rachel had come to visit his house directly. There, in the mailbox, was an eyeball that Rachel had obviously carefully positioned so that it would stare directly at him when he pulled the mailbox lid down. The eyeball had been crudely cut out, and the optic nerve was still attached, like a limp, bloody noodle. Greg felt the urge to vomit again, and forced it back down. Greg just stared at the eye, Something wasn't right. He looked closer at it. He noticed the iris was brown. That didn't make any sense. Rachel had blue eyes. Greg went inside to get his phone and, for the first time in days, checked his messages. He was unsurprised to find he had gotten dozens from Rachel, all demanding that he talk to her and meet with her, or risk getting more body parts. He didn't bother reading most of them, but he finally texted her back. "You were crazy, you know that?" he asked. "Ooh, you've been getting my gifts, I see," was her response. "Yeah, I've been getting the body parts you've been sending me, but something doesn't make sense. You sent me an eye today, but the iris of the eye is brown. Your eyes are blue." Greg waited a few seconds to see Rachel's response to his observation. "Oh my god! No wonder you haven't been responding to me. You thought I was cutting parts off myself and sending them to you?" Greg stared at the phone, completely nonplussed. "What? You haven't been?" he asked. "No, those body parts I've been sending you weren't mine. They're from your wife." Greg felt an icy chill go down the entire length of his body. "My wife is in Oregon, you stupid bitch. What are you talking about?" Greg texted. "No, she isn't. I have your wife here. I was waiting outside your house and I heard everything you both said to each other. I took her by your car while you were still inside, and I took her and the car to my special place. I sent a text to her family telling them something had come up and she wouldn't be coming to Oregon this week after all." Greg dropped his phone to the floor and ran back out to his mailbox where the eye was. Now that he looked at it more carefully, he realized that what Rachel had said was true. He recognized it as belonging to Emily. Greg collapsed to his knees and began to scream over and over again while his neighbors came out to see what was going on. He was still screaming insanely as the police arrived. A huge thank you to all of my poltergeists. Bobby Tripp, Calderin, Cheryl Meredith, Gary, Imugi, Joker Smurf 3, and Spirit Father. As always, your support is so appreciated, and thank you from the very bottom of my heart.